I suppose then I'm here to defend the humanities from quantitative research. I must apologize before I begin. It's normally custom for academics to read their papers, but I felt that it would be best today to talk about my research, much in the mode of Professor Sperber. I would like to start out by thanking Chaim for the invitation, and more so for the work that he's done. Truly an exceptional project that requires not only an enormous amount of skill in languages and close reading, but also tremendous discipline. And in a sense today I would like to come as a sort of foil to Chaim's research and ask a simple question. If I take Chaim's database and I focus on a few items in the database, can we tell anything? If I look at a single responsa or a single memoir or a single newspaper, what can we learn from small amounts of data? Are we able to make generalizations? And to some of you who know this method is called microhistory, which doesn't mean looking at small things, but rather to use the microscope as a sort of analytical tool in the study of history. And try and make generalizations much as someone would do from statistics. But I believe firmly that even from a single case, I understand we had some discussion about this morning, a close reading of a memoir, or in my case of She'elot v'Tshuvot, can yield some generalizations. In looking at Chaim's database, which I believe had over 5,000 entries when I looked at it, what emerged was interesting. The hero of the database is a man, a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. There are a number of people who feature in the database, obviously, but Rabbi Spector wrote approximately 550 responsa, 558 She'elot v'Tshuvot, specifically related to Agunot. And of all of those cases, he was unable to allow remarriage only in 3 cases. He was a great champion for, even under terribly difficult circumstances, as a rabbi relying on great leniency, to advocate on behalf of the Agunot. And I'll read a section of the responsa a little bit later. Much of the talk today has dealt with responsa literature, but has talked about responsa literature rather than focusing on what was the content of the literature, what was going on. And I would like to focus on 2 things today. Number one is the workings of a she'ela. Well, how does it work? What is the reasoning behind it, and particularly with relation to Agunot? And the second one is the broader context of the She'ela v'Tshuvah, particularly in relationship to rabbinic authority and the subject of these responsa about the Agunot herself. Part of the database, again, to focus on a specific period, I focused on the town of Novardok. Novardok was a small town, it still is a small town, in southwestern Lithuania. Between, I guess, east and west it would be Minsk and Grodno, and north and south would be Vilna and Branovich. And in some senses, Novardok was a typical Jewish town. In 1848, there were 2,576 Jews living in the town, and in 1897, there were 5,015 Jews living in the town, of a total population of 7,887. So the town was a majority Jewish population, but there were only 8,000 people in the town. It was a very small village. And typically, the trajectory of the village was the story that you know, the small provincial Jewish town that by the time of the Second World War had become more cosmopolitan. The sort of marketplace of ideas had expanded beyond just rabbinic authority, to have a Mizrahi school, to have a gymnasium, and Jewish life was much more Catholic in that sense. But in the time that I'm studying, the days that Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector was the rabbi of the town, which was 1851 to 1867, he published his first book of Responsa. At that point in time, he was somewhat known, but not the figure that he would become. By the time he passed away in 1896, he was perhaps the foremost rabbi in the entire world. He received responsa from all over the world, from England and from America as well, and dealt with the most serious problems. When he passed away, 2 yeshivot were named after him, one in Lithuania and one in America that still exists today. So his personality, not only in Chaim's database, but also in the popular imagination, was tremendous. But at this point in time, he wasn't yet that person that he would become. And I focused on 9 particular responses that he wrote during this period, between 1851 and 1857. And in those responsa, what I found was very interesting, and I'll deal with that in greater length. But in order to supplement the responsa, I focused on a number of different types of sources as well. I focused on memoirs of people who lived in the town at that point in time. There was a Yizkor book, a memorial book that was published on the town that also has a tremendous amount of useful information, wonderful stories, captions, sort of sociological and anthropological reflections. I also used newspapers. I used letters that people wrote to one another. I used other sorts of intellectual output, philosophy. There was a book of Musar, of ethics that was published in the town. And to sort of triangulate these cases. But my main focus was on the Responsa. Counterintuitively, what I learned was somewhat shocking. On the one hand, I was not shocked to find that Chaim was right. In terms of the Responsa and the other literature, there are many different types of Agunot, and that we should talk about with some sort of fluidity rather than some sort of monolithic conception. However, what was shocking to me was that the only literature that explicitly dealt with Agunot in the town of Novardok for these 25 years or so were Responsa literature. We have sort of in our imagination the rabbi as the figure of power, as the authority figure. In this particular context, the only person in literature that I studied in this town that advocated on behalf of the Agunot were the rabbis. The only place that we can see the voices of the Agunot, their circumstances, what they were struggling with, what the competing forces in the society that related to them were through Responsa literature. Now we're confronted with a terrible problem in understanding this evidence, because their voices only come from this source. And that is that the source is written by a man, and written by a man who is not asked by the woman. In none of the Responsa that he quote, although he does quote the woman, he's almost always approached by another rabbi who asked him, a more junior rabbi of a smaller village perhaps, that asked his opinion. So really we're hearing second-hand evidence from the voice of the rabbi who's looking at it from a halachic lens. But no doubt, as this is the only source that we can see, number one, we can see the sort of attitude that the society played, sort of played around the Aguna, as well as, because of the deep empathy that he had, certain aspects that highlight of the individual Aguna that's also useful. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, for my research, and I think for the discussion, to add to the discussion today, which has dealt a lot, again, around Sheilot v'Tshuvot, but not with the Sheilot v'Tshuvot themselves, what the halachic discussion was. So I'd like to open up, I'd really like to focus on 2 points at this point. How the Responsa worked, and also the nature of rabbinic authority. In dealing with Agunot, one has to understand that, first of all, that it's a tremendously difficult circumstance, obviously because of the people involved, and it's a crisis of individuals, as well as a crisis in the society where the woman perhaps can't remarry, or if she does remarry, then there's a challenge to the authority, there's a question about the children, what will other people do, etc. But the second thing in understanding Agunot is, on the halachic perspective, is one is dealing with uncertainty. All the questions that are asked to the rabbi are dealing with uncertainty, and this is no different. In the cases, the rabbi has to respond to what is, we have to establish the facts of what is at the moment. Is this woman married? Is this woman unmarried? Is her husband alive or dead? Is this get kosher or is it not kosher? So all the laws involved in Sheilot v'Tshuvot are balancing how to deal with this uncertainty. And lots of different theories and theoretical constructs and frameworks that we can adopt in order to deal with the uncertainty. So the first is to understand what the case is. What happened? And the second thing is what potential laws could apply or not apply. And the third is, how do those two things come to some sort of conclusion? And that's really where the genius of any posek, of any decider is. How you balance the facts of the case with the theoretical constructs. And to this extent, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Inspector was unlike any other person. His Sheilot v'Tshuvot are extraordinarily long and very, very complex. But the lengths that he goes to analyze, to be faithful to the traditional sources, while also empathizing with the facts of the case, is what makes it so extraordinary. So, for example, one of the first cases that he deals with is a woman who approached him, whose husband had disappeared, and she was an aguna for many years already. And the case was as follows: is the husband was a logger, somebody who worked on the river. There was a river there that had logs transporting down. And one day didn't come back from work. And it was known at the time that there was a tremendous storm on the river, and the woman felt that perhaps that was some recourse to be able to say that he had passed away, but no body turned up. the tremendous lengths that Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector goes into dealing with this uncertainty. Because again, what we have to understand is the uncertainty is, to such an extent, it's what we call midoraita, it's a biblical commandment. And theoretically, if she does remarry and has children, she's first of all not allowed to remarry, but second of all, the children are mamzerim, because the initial marriage was not dissolved. So unlike the case of some of the cases that Chaim mentioned where the husband wants to remarry, in that case it's not a biblical commandment. Here it is, and it's a bit more strict, and therefore the social consequences of such an action would be potentially very large. She would have to divorce the second husband, she would have to divorce the first husband, the children would be bastards, they would not be able to marry other people, so the consequences are quite dire. In this responsa, which is the first one, I believe that Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector develops sort of his central idea that's quoted very often, an idea that he calls trei ruba, two majorities. He tries to solve this problem. So the concept of trei ruba is as follows. In the case of a doubt, normally, if the doubt is biblical, we are not lenient. We are strict because it's a biblical problem. If it's rabbinic, if the case allows it, we are more lenient. What he does is two things. Number one, as often as possible, he tries to change the case from something that is biblical to something that is rabbinic, and therefore he has somewhat more flexibility in dealing with rabbinic concepts. And the second thing is he develops this idea of a double majority. Double majority means, in the case where we have a single majority, somebody who is out at sea, the chances are somebody who is out at sea with Mayim She'en Lahem Sof, is in the middle of the ocean, the chances are that he dies. However, that's not enough to overthrow a biblical commandment. A single majority, majority of the time that somebody's out at sea, he does not survive, is not enough. But Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector developed this idea that if you have two majorities that happen at the same time, that's enough to overturn it. So for example, with the case of this lager, he felt that number one, the majority of times that people were in this circumstance where there was a tremendous storm that he sort of washed away, they wouldn't survive. And in fact, because all the logs were falling, the majority of the time that somebody was sort of subject to this storm, they would pass away. And the second one is a theory that he developed that's based on social circumstance, and that is what the likelihood of the husband having reported back to the family had he survived. And he felt that at this particular circumstance, and again at other circumstances this perhaps would not apply, certainly based on the information that Chaim has provided, he felt that had the husband survived, majority of the time it would be known that the husband survived. He would either report back to the family or it would be known amongst other people. And therefore at the same instance, when he was washed away, we have a double rov, and therefore after much discussion he allows it. An interesting caveat to every single one of his 158 responsa is his tendency or his inability or his unwillingness to rely on his own logic. He produces a response, oftentimes pages and pages and pages, tens if not hundreds of sources, and almost every single time, in fact every single time that I've seen it, he says, do not rely on my responsa, it needs to be established by other rabbis as well, and if they need to read my responsa carefully, and in the case that they agree with my responsa, we can continue forward. I want to just read briefly a piece from one of his later responsa that echoes this. And I think what's interesting here is not only his intellectual sophistication, which unfortunately I had to abridge some of that out, but also his empathy with the circumstance, his tendency towards leniency, even at great personal expense, because at the end of the day, not only is the social circumstance a problem if she survives, his authority as a rabbi is seriously suspect. So that's the second thing. And finally, I think what's interesting is the empathy that he has, and then also this sort of humility that he has, his inability or his unwillingness to rely solely on himself. I quote, at the end of his response he writes, God has helped me to develop an approach which will permit the Agunot to remarry. My point of view is firmly based upon the foundations of halacha, in accordance with the truths of our Torah. Nevertheless, due to the stringencies of the matter, I will not allow my decision to be operable until you agree with me, he's responding to another rabbi, and also to attain the approbation of two leading Gaonim of our generation. I am also desirous that they read my entire responsa on the matter. Perhaps they will agree with my premise, perhaps they can continue to add to it. They should not consider this too difficult. He's saying, unlike other rabbis at the time, he was more willing to, or he was a great advocate of Agunot, and encouraged other rabbis to respond in kind. He wrote, everybody knows how weak I am, and of my occupation with communal matters. Nevertheless, I felt that I must devote my time to writing this lengthy responsum. I must do whatever I can for this unfortunate woman, because this is one of the great mitzvot. The rabbis have declared that permitting an Agunot to remarry is equal to rebuilding the ruins of Jerusalem. And again, this sort of thing follows through all the Responsa. The second thing is about rabbinic authority. So we see already this need for confirmation. And in understanding questions of Aguna, we have to understand that there's competing tensions here. The Aguna the question sits at the nexus of an individual problem, a woman who comes to the rabbi, who has her own stories, who has her own difficulties, who has consequences. The social phenomenon, which is the society that she lives in, the community, what happens if you allow one, how do you deal with other cases, and also the intellectual element, which is no small part, and I think we as historians tend to minimize, and that is a genuine, truthful, close reading to the best of one's ability of the halachot. So again, I think the takeaway here from this issue of the rabbinic authority is this counterintuitive fact, which is that the rabbi is the voice of the Aguna. And it's a troubling fact, and it troubles me how to read the Responsa as a historian, to be able to tease out, to read against the grain, and find the voice of the Aguna. Oftentimes only quoted in snippets, oftentimes the circumstances are unknown, the context is unknown. But again, I think if you, somewhat like, if I can make the comparison, like Inquisition records in a sense, to read from the perspective of the rabbi does not stop us from accessing the subject matter that he's talking about. And I want to read one more piece from a response that he gave. And again, I think it would be worthwhile for anybody who's studying this matter to read through these responsa to understand the complexities of the circumstances that they were dealing with, and also the weight of the intellectual tradition that they were dealing with. He writes also in an early response of the same period, and I think this sort of articulates the empathy that he approached it with. But since, in the case under consideration, such an act of not allowing her to remarry, would cause great suffering and distress to the woman and her family, furthermore it was not her fault, she accepted the divorce in good faith, it was the rabbi's error, I therefore see fit to follow a more lenient approach, although it is against many of the later authorities. To stand up against the later authorities was not something easy and not something his contemporaries were oftentimes willing to do. But one must notice two things. Number one is that system of rabbinic authority, and the second thing is how the responsa worked. He ends off the responsa with this. This wasn't the motivation. The process is almost three steps for him. The first step is establishing what the facts were, clearly. The second step is understanding the intellectual tradition. What tools do we have to solve this problem? Sort of like Sherlock Holmes, or in fact like a historian himself. This is the evidence that we're presented with. How can we approach it? What tools do we have? And to end off with this empathetic note, encouraging other rabbis to continue to do so, really displaying his connection to the individual problem. Again, Agunot is the nexus between intellectual tradition, the social circumstances, and also the individual. I want to end off here at this point, and I want to mention two things. Number one is the general method. I think that there is something to be gained from a close reading, something that's lost on a large amount of statistics. In fact, this very sort of notion of empathy, these individual cases, each one is an individual case that has tremendous fascination and is oftentimes tremendously painful and sad, and all unique. However, in doing so, we're oftentimes presented on such a limited scale with such a specific context, a particular town at a particular period of time, with evidence that doesn't easily lend itself towards generalizations. Memoirs or letters or newspapers, and each one needs its own tools to be able to read, a sensitivity, as well as sort of a methodology for incorporating all of them together. So I hope I presented something that's just a small part of a larger project that sort of hopefully accompanies the work of what Chaim is doing and in no way takes away from what he was doing. In fact, I would have been completely unable to approach it as such without his work. And I would like to end off with a question, and the question is based on that sort of analogy of the rabbi to the historian. And the role of empathy as in history. On one hand, it could be a bias, it could be a stereotype, something that we have that holds us back from accessing the truth. On the other hand, there's a necessity to be able to approach our subjects beyond numbers, beyond statistics, beyond the generalizations, each of them as a case in and of themselves. And I think no case best shows that than the Agunot. Thank you.